My guest right now is a special guest. I always enjoy talking with Pat Buchanan, former senior advisor to the President Reagan and a presidential candidate himself, and of course also very opinionated. As a matter of fact, I've heard your opinion on the strikes in Syria, and I have to admit I was a little disappointed. So maybe we can talk about this, and you either can bring me your way or I can bring you mine. How about that?
Good enough.
Because you know what it reminds me of, and you were there, when Ronald Reagan back in 1981 told those the Petco employees that if they didn't come back to work, they were all fired. And I believe to this day that when he sent that strong message to the world, really, it made Mikhail Gorbachev think twice about getting into a tussle with him. And I believe what Donald Trump just did is going to affect the way all these other leaders, especially these strong men who've been getting away with murder for the last 20 years, are going to treat him. What do you think?
I would let me say this, that there's no doubt about it that the leader of Syria, Bashar Assad, is a thug and a killer, and he may deserve what he got. But my concern with this strike is, first of all, it's a one-off strike. You sent missiles into an airfield. You didn't even incapacitate the airfield. And the next day, Bashar Assad launched planes out of that airfield at the very same place where he allegedly dropped the poison gas. So I think it was ineffectual in that sense. It was rash. The president has no authority to attack Syria, which is a country which has not attacked us and does not threaten us. And if you want a united country behind what you're doing, he should bring the Congress back and say, here's what they did and here's what we're going to do. Or, I think even better than that, he should have worked up at the UN if he said, look, we know who did this. We're going to go in and inspect it. We're going to prove to the world that he used poison gas on his own people. And then you'd have a united world and a united country behind you.
I don't know.
He didn't do any of these things.
Yeah, but I don't know that the United Nations, they've been totally ineffective in regard to this, and so has the world leaders. I mean, nobody has acted in 6 years in spite of the fact that he continued to slaughter his people. And at some point...
Where do we get the right to launch a war against Syria?
Well, I don't know that we launched a war against Syria. We launched an attack against his capability to deliver sarin gas, and that much we know.
Well, I mean, if they'd launched airstrikes, if Russia or someone launched airstrikes on an American airfield in the United States, I think we would regard it as an act of war. What I'm saying, Joyce, is, look, they didn't think this through, in my judgment. And what they ought to do is call Paul Ryan back from his little vacation and call Mitch McConnell back and have the president explain why he's doing what he is doing. What is our policy? What is our objective? Are we going to overthrow Bashar Assad? Regime change? That's what we get when we hear from Nikki Haley.
Right, but we
have General Mattis saying we're not going into Syria. This is a one-off.
Right.
And Donald Trump is saying the same thing. We've got an incoherent, inconsistent policy. And in my judgment, it was very rash what he did.
Well, I think I sort of like the whole idea of keep them guessing. And you know, I can see some of your point. But I have to tell you that from the perspective of how the world is viewing America, there's a significant shift right now. No longer are we being perceived of as these, leading from behind namby-pamby folks. That was not working well for the world. You look at the Middle East, you look at Europe, you look at America today, and you see how weakness affects everybody's lives. And I believe that, we can't stand by any longer. Plus, when you say go to Congress, he doesn't have to go to Congress. If Congress wants to come back and debate this or impeach him for doing something that they think is unconstitutional, let him have at it. Instead of Rand Paul getting on television every 10 minutes or John McCain or Lindsey Graham, come back to Washington and start impeachment hearings. But they're not going to do that. These people are ineffective.
I don't want them to start impeachment hearings. I would like to have them.
If it's
come
unconstitutional,
back.
that's what has to happen.
Well, I mean, it's unconstitutional. In my judgment, it's unconstitutional. But they're not going to do that. I don't think they ought to do that. But I don't think the president should be given carte blanche to lay down red lines and take us into war when somebody crosses them, when the war has not been authorized by the Congress of the United States.
Right.
I mean, we're supposed to be constitutional Republicans.
Right.
Secondarily, while everybody is talking about how big and hairy-chested we are right now, Joyce, what are we going to do? Well, if it continues, the Russians don't seem intimidated. The Iranians don't seem intimidated. Hezbollah doesn't seem intimidated. Are we going to overthrow Assad? We hear they're talking about regime change. That is certainly war.
Yeah.
And that's what Nikki Haley is talking about. At the same time, General
Mattis is not.
General Mattis says this is a one-off shot.
Yeah. Well, and I just, as I said before, I think it was a show of strength. I don't believe there's any intent to go in there. We're fighting ISIS. We don't know what would replace of the many warring factions that are in Syria right now. We don't even have a likely successor. So that's certainly
That's exactly right.
Yeah,
that's
not the plan.
We punched him in the nose, and he ignored it, and then he started bombing again.
Well, we reduced the capacity, and from what I understand, the planes that took off the next day were the few that already had fueled. And that didn't effectively change anything. More importantly, though, I guess what I'm saying is, you say that Russia doesn't look rattled. I think just the opposite. I think the fact that now they're announcing that Vladimir Putin is going to meet with Rex Tillerson tells me that he's rattled. Pat, in reality, can they come up against us now? The GDP of Russia is less than the state of California.
Well, there's no question about it. I mean, the Russian Navy is no match for the American Sixth Fleet. I followed that Soviet or Russian aircraft carrier. It came out of Murmansk all the way down the North Sea through the English Channel, all the way around into the Med. And then it had about 15 planes, and 2 of them dropped into the sea.
Right.
And it was a disaster. That's their main carrier. There's no question about it. They can't rival the U.S. Navy.
Right.
But I do believe this. I think that Donald Trump was elected because he said he was going to impose a new foreign policy on the United States, that the United States would stop, would move closer to Russia, which is a great power, a strategic power, and the United States would stay out of these endless and unwinnable wars like Syria. And he's utterly reversed that, and I think in a way he is losing an awful lot of people who were with him all the way.
Look, you make some fair points, and you're right. There's a lot of people who have, come up against this decision, and a lot of the usual suspects who didn't like Donald Trump who are now cheering for him, and that always concerns
me. Well, they're
me.
cheering for him because they want to get us into various wars.
Yeah,
take a look at John McCain. He wanted to intervene in Georgia. He's big on sending weapons into Ukraine. He and the neocons want a big. Iran is always in their sights. I mean, have we not had enough of these wars, we Americans?
Yeah, no.
We've resolved none of them. We've been in one of them in Afghanistan for 15 years. We've been 13 years in Iraq. Libya is a complete disaster. I mean, Yemen, the poor people down there are starving, and we're going to help blockade the only port where they're getting food in because the Saudis are demanding it. Where is the success? I mean, Donald Trump is president of the United States because he promised to do away with the foreign policy that produced these disasters.
Yeah, well, but the Obama administration, showed nothing but weakness, and you had the Arab Spring, which is really what had everything degenerating in certainly in the Middle East. And
what that tells you is you don't go in there and try to create democracies where you don't have the conditions that are ripe for them.
But do you not think there's ever a reason to stop genocide?
Oh, of course there's a reason to stop genocide. But look, let's take the genocide in Ukraine when Joseph Stalin starved all those Ukrainians somewhere between 5 and 9 million in 1933. They were all dying at the very time that FDR recognized Stalin. He and his people, Kaganovich and the others, were perpetrating this horror called the Holodomor, the forgotten Holocaust in the Ukraine. They did nothing.
Right.
The reason that FDR, I think, recognized the Soviet Union then is because he was concerned about the rise of Hitler. And he said, we need someone to balance it off. Horrible things happen, Joyce, and we ought to do our best to prevent them. But the United States cannot go around the world righting every wrong. that's a way that a lot of great powers have ended their lives.
Yeah. Well, listen, it certainly, it gave me some things to think about, and think I will. What do you think about this little madman in North Korea now, rattling his sabers?
Well, I don't know that he's a mad. I mean, I do agree with you. He's provocative. I'm not sure he's a madman. If he were actually mad or insane, frankly, you cannot have an insane man with nuclear weapons. I don't care what.
Right.
But here's another case. There was George Bush, remember, getting up there, the world's worst dictators are not going to be allowed to get the world's worst weapons.
Yeah.
Well, he's got them.
Yeah.
What did all that bluster do? I think that we ought not to provoke him, but there's no question about it that on the proposition that North Korea cannot be allowed to build an intercontinental ballistic missile that can hit the United States, that can carry nuclear weapons, I think there's general agreement on that.
Right. But who's going to stop them? I mean, we finally got China saying they're going to work with us.
Well, I think if they don't stop them with economic sanctions or oustra the regime or something like that, but again, that's something everybody ought to be agreed upon. But, I don't believe for a second that this guy's going to launch a nuclear missile at the American troops or American bases, because it would be his annihilation. And I don't think he's a madman. I think he's an evil man, but I don't think he's mad.
That's interesting. The first person I've seen draw that distinction. I'm not sure what he is, but I don't want him to have the capability of, harming American troops or harming or a missile landing across the.
Well, I'm afraid they've got about 11,000 artillery pieces on the DMZ,
right?
Half of which could hit the capital of South Korea. And if a war began, South Korea's capital city could be in many ways devastated. And so I think you have to watch what you're doing. But I cannot believe that this fellow, I don't believe that anyone that is hostile to the United States, and many countries are, really want an all-out war with the United States, because no matter what they could do to us, there's no question that what would happen to them.
Right. Well, I think that's true, and I think that we haven't shown that kind of strength in a while, and maybe you're right, it has to be tempered, but it certainly was a relief for many of us who are just tired of leading from behind. It doesn't work. I'd like to see some powerful displays of our might, and what better way than to stop sarin gas being dropped on people? I would have,
Well, I mean, if in that sense. There's no question about it. This was a horrendous thing, but those barrel bombs aren't any nicer when you consider how many of 400,000 people have died in this civil war.
Right.
As I wrote in my column, and there must be tens of thousands of children and babies and women in that
maimed
combined total.
Yeah.
And their deaths, I'm sure, were no more pleasant than what happened with the gas of those 20 children.
That's right, and nobody speaks of all of the maimed and permanently damaged women and children.
You've got to realize that they're not only being killed by Assad, they're being killed by the people who are trying to overthrow Assad.
Yeah.
And that the uprising with ISIS and Al-Qaeda, even the U.S.-backed rebels, you've got them in there. You've got Hezbollah, Iranians, Russian planes, American planes, Turkish planes, Kurds. You have everyone and everything in there, and all of them are doing a good measure of killing. I'd like to see the war stopped.
Yeah. Well, I hear you, and I thank you for coming on. As always, a challenging partner to discuss things with.
Well, it's wonderful talking to you again.
All right, you take care. Pat Buchanan, read the article. We have it linked at our website for those of you who haven't read it already.